Let me ask you a question. Do you care if the people you play against in games like Warzone are cheating? Or if they're even real people? Online PvP is over. The idea that you can log into a game, get matched up against a new opponent, and take part in a fair match is out of the window now, and it's not ever coming back. But what went wrong with online gaming, and what's the future going to look like? That's what I'm going to answer in today's video. If you enjoy this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Originally, online PvP gaming tried to solve a problem that became apparent in the sort of N64 PS1 era. Split screen multiplayer was super fun. Lots of people have really fond memories of playing Mario Kart 64 or GoldenEye with 4 people crowded around the TV, all having an absolute blast. But it was super hard to organise. A lot of people just couldn't get a group of friends around at one time to play 4-player games regularly, so often the multiplayer modes of games, or even games that were designed around multiplayer entirely, which were often the best ones, were going unused or unplayed by the majority of players. In the Xbox One era, I remember getting 16 people together to play Halo 1 with 4 Xboxes on a local area network with 4 TVs, and it was absolutely amazing. But we only ever did it once because finding that many people with enough time and the willpower to go and bring 4 TVs and 4 Xboxes and a bunch of network cables over to someone's house, let alone having the space to do all of that, was incredibly rare. It was an amazing feature of the game to be able to play 16-player Halo 1 that I doubt many people ever got to try at the time, because it was just too inconvenient. On PC, the problem was being solved already. Many games could be played online, where all you needed was someone's IP address to connect to them, regardless of distance. Services started where you could have something like a username or a friends list, and it made connecting to other players so much simpler. Small online communities started to form where people would share their details to play against other people who had the same interests, but finding the communities was often pretty difficult. Different approaches were tried. Some games and communities focused on clans that would advertise on forums to attract like-minded people. Then they would communicate on forums or something like ICQ or instant messaging to try and organise games amongst themselves, or even competing against rival clans. Server browsers let players customize their own rules and then advertise them in the title or the details section of the server, so they could be browsed and filtered at will. You could play Battlefield and decide you wanted to play a specific mode with a specific custom rule set, even specific mods being installed, and then you could easily find other servers where people were playing the exact game and modes and maps that you wanted to play. These were usually run by community members and they were moderated by them too, so players who were cheating or who were toxic could just be banned on a whim, and many servers and clans employed whitelists, where you could only play on that server if somebody else was essentially vouching for you and had added you to that whitelist. It was all incredibly hands-off from developers. The developers just made the game and built these tools that let the community kind of manage themselves. Of course, this wasn't perfect. The groups and server admins themselves could be the toxic ones. They could be super exclusionary and often very hard to find. Normal people who are playing games just didn't spend the time to find or create one of these groups, so regular players often wouldn't really get involved in multiplayer. It was dedicated to the most hardcore players, and that made the whole kind of exclusionary problem even worse. Online matchmaking came along as an answer. You could have a constant stream of opponents any time of day. You could choose if you wanted to communicate with them or not, what type of game you wanted to play by using playlists and things like that, and it would do all of the work. Key to its success was the incredibly low barrier of entry. It was extremely low effort on the part of the player. Normally on the main menu you would just have an option like Quick Match, you would click it and it would do all the work for you. This opened up multiplayer to a much more general audience of normal players, and it became the normal way to play games. You would log in, press Quick Match, and hop into a game with complete strangers. Over time, things like server browsers started getting phased out of the mainstream games, so matchmaking was all you had. Something like Call of Duty would often have lots of different playlists, and Halo was the same, where you would choose a specific game mode that you wanted to play, and it would just match you up with other people who wanted to play that mode. But this wasn't perfect either. Matchmaking had already been a thing for quite a while, with some more accessible games like chess and Scrabble, and they had already run into a problem: cheaters. Online matchmaking was largely anonymous. People were competing and wanted to win, but now found that even if they were the best player amongst their friends group or their family, getting dropped into a matchmaking pool of thousands or even millions of players meant that the competition was much tougher. Lots of gamers found that they'd gone from being a big fish in a little pond to being a tiny fish in the ocean. But they still wanted to win, and they didn't mind being dishonest to strangers that they'd never meet, so some people just started cheating. In online chess and Scrabble, cheating is incredibly simple. All you need is a computer program that's very good at working out the best moves, and as everybody knows, there are computer programs that can beat the very best chess players, and Scrabble's a game that's just always got an optimal move. And all you need to do is work out what that computer program would do in your situation, and then you copy it. You input that as your own commands. The state of the game in something like chess or Scrabble is much easier to read than in an online FPS game, so it's much easier for a computer to tell you what the optimal move is, and you don't need to interfere with the game's code or the computer's memory at all. You just input the game state into a separate computer. If you're playing something like chess, you can just do the moves that your opponent is doing and then see whatever the computer does, and that's the move that you play against the other real player. This makes cheating essentially undetectable. Of course, you can look at things like how long a player takes to decide their moves, or run your own cheat engine playing a game to see if the enemy player is picking the same moves as a computer program would, but these are still fairly easily worked around by a cheater. Competitive online chess and Scrabble with random matchmaking was essentially over as soon as it began, because the problem was unsurmountable. You couldn't tell if someone was cheating, so you couldn't ensure matches were fair. Modern online video games have taken longer to get to that point, but they're reaching it now. Game states are much more difficult to read and change much more quickly. In a match of Warzone, there's constantly hundreds of things happening every second. A player could never input all of that information into another PC and get a useful response that could help them. For a long while, cheats in these kind of games relied on being able to read the memory of the game itself. The programs could extract information about the game state in real time and then give the player extra information that they shouldn't have, or could manipulate their inputs to make sure they made the best possible actions, like aiming perfectly and shooting as soon as an enemy appears. While these cheats can be incredibly sophisticated, reading information directly from CPU processes as they happen, or use things like fake hardware to access information stored in a memory in a kind of sneaky way where the computer won't realize what's going on, they can essentially be caught with anti-cheat software, designed to look for processes reading things it shouldn't be, or changing things it shouldn't be. As long as the cheat is running on the computer that's running the game, there's a way for it to be detected. So what's changed now? Basically, cheats are being developed that don't need to interfere with the computer running the game at all. The computer is constantly outputting a video signal, and that's a kind of one-way stream. Once that video signal is out of the computer doesn't care what happens to it anymore. No information needs to come back about it. New cheats based on AI machine learning can use the information in the video signal, things like checking for brief flashes of information on the minimap, or almost invisible traces of enemies on the screen, or even things like the recoil of the weapons you're using, and manipulate this to give the player a huge advantage. These can all be run off a capture card that intercepts the video signal after it left the computer, or even built into the monitor itself. MSI showed off a monitor that could cheat like this in League of Legends at CES 2024. It could use information from the minimap to display kind of arrows on a player's screen, showing where enemy players were about to come from or where they could be found. This would be a huge advantage for the players and was completely undetectable by the game. It wouldn't appear on any streams or captures. All it would appear on is the monitor of the person playing the game. You can imagine just how helpful it would be for a monitor using this technology in Warzone to highlight enemies that you can see on screen that maybe with the naked eye you might miss or you might not be able to quite work out where they are, or to translate minimap information onto player views, like maybe if it could see a red dot on a minimap and up arrow or down arrow, it could display a kind of red haze showing you the area that that player has to be in on your screen, or even could be used in tandem with a device that manipulates your inputs to give you things like aimbot or recoil control. It's important to note that this technology isn't hypothetical. It already works, and the fact that companies as big as MSI are producing it and showing it off in a public forum like CES, where they are just advertising it as a feature, I think they called it SkySight, means that it's going to become mainstream sooner rather than later. And it's important to remember that companies like MSI don't necessarily care about the fact that it's cheating. They probably don't care about the integrity of your games. They just want things that will make people buy monitors. So if they can release something where some people will say, oh, I'm going to buy an MSI monitor over an Aorus one because the MSI one will let me get an advantage in games, people are going to do that. Of course, these cheats aren't as convenient as a USB stick you just download something onto and then plug into your PC to enable cheats. That's got a super low barrier of entry. That's probably why so many people are cheating in games like Warzone right now. Not as many people are going to be willing to spend lots of money to get a special monitor just so they can get an advantage in Warzone. But people do already spend hundreds or thousands of pounds on monitors that have super high resolutions or super high frame rates, so there's already some precedent set that some people will do this. And as long as it's completely undetectable by developers, which it will be because again, this is all something that's running on a monitor, the PC has no idea it's happening at all, there's very little a game developer could do to stop it. So players you're playing against could be doing this. Going back to online chess and Scrabble for a moment, the leading sites that enable online play for those have developed versions of anti-cheat, despite the problems that we've been talking about of undetectable cheats. They rely on things like statistical analysis, so looking at a player and saying, hey, they've done the optimal move 90% of the time, or player reports, or AI systems trained on identifying patterns to issue bans. Of course, all of these systems are fallible. They'll occasionally get an innocent player banned, and savvy cheaters who have a vague understanding of how these systems work will be able to avoid them. Maybe in a chess game they'll only use the computer to cheat for them in 1 out of every 5 moves. That'll still give them a really big advantage, but maybe it won't be quite as obvious and won't get them a ban. This will essentially be the limit of anti-cheat in games like Warzone. This is where they will get to, and again, I think this is in the very near future. They will have to rely on player reports, they'll have to rely on statistical analysis, saying, hey, this player is suddenly gone from, a 1 kill death to a 5 kill death, what's happened there? Or they're winning a lot more games than usual, or they're hitting headshots 80% of the time, whereas before they used to hit headshots 10% of the time. Something like that, with probably some machine learning, some AI to back it up to identify those patterns, and that's how they'll be able to ban people. And already we've seen in the Warzone community, lots of people are unhappy with those kind of systems because they get shadow banned, they say they're perfectly innocent, so something is probably going wrong, while other people who are cheating have used cheats that have been developed in such a way where it doesn't trigger the same suspicion. You can't tell if someone is cheating or not. We'll be left in a situation where there's just a constant battle to guess whether someone is cheating or not, and there won't be any definite answers or way to prove anything one way or another. So this all comes back to that question at the start of the video. Do you care if the people you play against are cheating, or if they're even real people? If you do care whether or not people are cheating, then you essentially can't play online PvP in games like Call of Duty, even now. Some people, of course, don't care. They're happy to run around and enjoy the gameplay without worrying about being competitive, and some games embrace that idea more than others. In games with hefty PvE components, there's often a lot to do and enjoy, even if other players in the game seem to be cheating, like in GTA Online. Of course, at some point, their cheats might start affecting you. In GTA Online, a player gets bored and starts rage hacking and then ends up killing everyone on the map. Then it becomes a problem when they start griefing you, but up until then, people are kind of happy to play the game even knowing people are cheating. For me, in Warzone, ever since Caps Locked released that video where a cheater explained what they could do and how easy it was and how difficult it was to spot, it's killed a lot of the enjoyment of the game for me. Every time I die, I think, oh, that could have been unfair, that could have been a cheater. Because then it starts to feel like I'm essentially an NPC, just another target for the main player, who is the person using cheats, to kill because they've got an impossible advantage. Of course, maybe, and probably, I'm in loads of games where there aren't any cheaters, but since it's impossible to tell the difference between a good player and a cheater, the difference doesn't really matter psychologically. I'm still in that mental state of the players I'm up against could be cheating. Even if you play on console with crossplay off, so you're playing on a PlayStation 5, you're still not entirely safe. The enemy might be using a controller that has some kind of features that helps them with things like recoil control. They might be using some sort of monitor that has a constant crosshair centered, even if you get flashbanged and things like that. Or they could be using one of these MSI monitors with SkySight, where they've trained it to identify and highlight players. With these kind of cheats, especially the MSI monitor one, I'm assuming they're just the first company to show off. I'm assuming lots of companies will be releasing things like that soon. There's no way you're ever going to know whether the person you're up against is engaging in things fairly. I'm finding Warzone a lot less fun when I don't know if each fight is fair, and I'm almost convinced no fight is ever really fair. This is going to get much worse, and there's no way for it to improve if the cheats are impossible to detect. But there are ways around this, and this is where the video gets a bit more positive. While developers can't ever solve this problem with cheaters, they can change their games to make it much less of an issue, or even avoid it entirely. So, in the second part of this video, I have for you 3 different ways we could keep online PvP working and fun. Let me know in the comments what you think about these options. So, number 1 is that you replace enemy players with bots. As machine learning improves, bots can be made much more lifelike than ever, and you can control exactly what they're capable of to make them mimic real players who aren't cheating. With bots as enemies, you can have perfect skill matchmaking, you can have perfect connections if they're running on your machine, and the player population for every game or mode suddenly doesn't matter. You can customize them to your heart's content. If you want enemies who never camp, that's fine, turn camping behavior off. If you want to fight players who are much worse than you, there's no need for a VPN anymore, just turn the bot difficulty down. If you want a challenge, you can turn it up. This is obviously already possible. You can load up a game of Call of Duty multiplayer right now, add a load of bots to a match, and have fun playing a game where you know the enemy aren't cheating, or at least they're not doing anything that they shouldn't be, because they're just bots. They're just limited by the game's code. If you want to play against easier enemies, just set them all to recruit. If you want to play against harder enemies, set them all to veteran. You can play exactly against the skill levels you want to play. You can even have a big mix. And the lobbies even stay together at the end of the game. You're still playing against the same bots. But the real issue with this approach is the player's mentality. Do you care if the enemy players are real? Often with newer Battle Royale games, and even some established ones like Fortnite or the Battle Royale in Call of Duty Mobile, you'll sometimes come up against bots as opponents, especially when you first start the game, and the game doesn't really make it super clear that this is happening. Does that bother you? Often real opponents won't be communicating anyway, so functionally, they're exactly the same. As long as the AI is programmed well, you shouldn't be able to tell the difference. For me, it does bother me. I'm not sure why, but I like knowing I'm playing against other people like me. People who can celebrate, get frustrated, make mistakes, behave unpredictably. Maybe I just haven't seen AI that's effective at imitating players yet, but it does feel a bit like a game is shallow or hollow if I don't have a real opponent. If I play a custom match of Modern Warfare 3 in a lobby full of bots, it doesn't feel the same as if I'm playing against other real players. And I'd be hard pushed to tell you exactly what the difference is. Similarly, in racing games like the more modern Forza games, they use those drive avatars where all of the enemy cars are bots and they're meant to kind of mimic the real life behavior of people on your friends list. But in my experience, racing against those bot cars is completely different to racing against other real players. Maybe it's because that idea that I talked about earlier about whether you're the NPC or the main character, if you're playing against bots, it's almost too obvious that you're the main character and that everything else is kind of working around you. So if you're having a bad race, maybe they'll slow down a little bit to make it easier on you. And if you're having a really good race, they'll drive a little bit harder. And similarly, in a game of Call of Duty and multiplayer, it always feels like the enemy bots are a bit too predictable. They just don't quite act like real people. So if that option's no good, a second option is just to make games that focus on PvE. Obviously, there's more problems with PvP than just the cheating. There's toxicity, there's monetization brushing up against pay to win, and the basic idea that everybody who's playing the game would like to win. In a solos game of Warzone, if everything was fair and skill-based matchmaking was really as strict as people make out, you should be winning games 1% of the time. Because every time you win one game of Warzone solos, 99 other people are going to lose. I feel like a lot of players wouldn't be satisfied with winning one game out of every 100. Would you? Does it bother you at all that if you have, say, a 5% win rate in Warzone, so you win 1 in every 20 games, that there's extra people now who maybe aren't winning any games? Because, again, every time you beat other players, that's a group of people who haven't won a game. PvE games kind of get around this problem, and they've had a bit of a renaissance of late, with games like Helldivers 2, Palworld, and Lethal Company all doing incredibly well. These are games where every single player can win. The level of challenge can be adjusted by the developers, or even by the players with separate difficulties. When I hop in a game of Helldivers 2 with my friends, I can choose whether I want to put it on a really hard difficulty where we'll probably lose, but the victory might, mean something a bit more to us, or I can put it on a really easy difficulty, so we don't need to pay attention, we can just relax and we'll win the game really easily. And also, if another player's cheating on your team, even if you've done some random matchmaking, it doesn't really affect you that much. You still get the fun of playing with random people whenever you want, but your fun isn't reliant on them being honest. You can just leave the game and match up with some other people. You can just let them cheat and accept that the game's going to be a bit easier for you. It's much less frustrating to have a cheater on your team in a PvE game than it is to come up against one in PvP. In Call of Duty, PvE modes are constantly tried. I get the impression the developers really want to make a PvE mode work. We've had loads of different variations of zombies, we've had Spec Ops, the raids. DMZ did have PvE elements, but the game could still be ruined by cheaters because of the PvP side of it. But sadly, I don't think any of these modes have ever really caught on. Otherwise, they'd still be investing in them as much as they do in Warzone. I see lots of people saying they don't understand why DMZ or zombies don't have more content and more features, and I'm sure the answer must just be it's not making enough money. That they're not worth the level of investment they need, so they just don't keep with them. Maybe they just haven't found the right mode for Call of Duty PvE or perfected a formula. But I think whatever they do, there's always going to be some competitive players who just want to play against other real people. I know for me with DMZ, when people would keep saying, oh, when you're playing DMZ, you should just be doing the PvE stuff. I personally found that very boring. I needed the PvP aspect of it to keep it interesting. And I think MWZ with Modern Warfare 3 was just never that interesting to me without any PvP in it. So now we come to the final option, and the one that I personally think makes the most sense. And that's to do what a lot of chess and Scrabble players did, and just abandon matchmaking. We could go back to those early days of small communities in clans and server browsers with whitelists, small community managed groups where individual community leaders and admins decide on the game rules, who they want to let play, and how they deal with suspicious players. Once chess players get serious and start entering tournaments, they have a reputation that follows them, and game developers could do a lot to make sure your player profile is as public as possible and difficult to shake. Then, if a player is thought to be cheating, you can let their peers decide if they still want them in that community. Plus, if you have actual social ties to the people in your community, because, it's a group that you've found and you've been added to the whitelist, it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult to convince yourself that cheating in games against them is a good idea. In my mind, this would have tons of positive effects. Different communities could play with different rules and server settings. Some might enforce strict skill limits and requirements, others might be a bit more general and lax with it. developers could encourage or even run communities for specific groups and regions that have been underrepresented in the past. Of course, you would still run into the same social issues that we talked about earlier. There would be toxic communities and admin, there would be exclusionary groups. But I feel like social media has come so far in the last couple of decades that a lot of these problems have already been improved, if not solved, by other services. Things like Discord have had loads of experience in trying to manage lots and lots of different separate smaller communities, and the learnings from that could be used in these games. The other problems of these groups being too small to function effectively, you know, right now, if you want to find a group that plays Call of Duty private lobbies, you're probably going to have quite a difficult time. I think that problem would be solved partially if it was the default way to play games. If we got rid of the idea of playlists and quick match and online matchmaking, and instead, when you loaded up a game, the first thing you saw was, hey, let's find you a community. Here's a server browser, here's some filters, let's find you a place where you belong. Even have some developer-run communities for new players where maybe they can meet up with people and get encouraged to find some friendship groups. This is basically what's happened to racing games already. Racing games have a slightly different problem in that it's not just cheaters they have to worry about, but people who don't know how to follow the rules of a race. Following race rules is an incredibly difficult thing to enforce in games, so things like doing a sort of dodgy overtake, not leaving people enough space, all of those problems are quite hard to enforce in the game engine, so instead they just have small communities, they have leagues, where you basically have to get whitelisted, you have to get accepted into that group, and if you don't play the way other people want you to, then you get kicked out of the group and you can't play with them anymore. For me, a move away from online matchmaking with randoms towards smaller communities would be hugely positive. Many of my best times with Call of Duty and Warzone have been in private games, and while currently the custom game lobby private game system is absolutely terrible, it's under-supported and it's missing a ton of options, it crashes all of the time. If it became the default way to play Warzone, I think there's a huge amount of potential.